On a storm-soaked backroad in Oregon, former Navy SEAL David Brown slowed down when he saw a family walking in the rain. A mother pulling two kids close, and a father trailing behind with a soaked duffel and panic in his eyes. David nearly kept driving until Gus, his sable German Shepherd, went still and growled low, like a warning God placed in the dark. That one choice didn't just give them warmth, it dragged them into a fight for truth, safety, and a home greedy hands tried to steal. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, subscribe for more tales of courage, redemption, and the quiet miracles God still works through weary warriors and loyal dogs. Rain hammered the Oregon backroad like thrown gravel, turning the forest into a dark cathedral of dripping pines and blurred headlights. David Brown kept both hands on the wheel of his battered SUV, knuckles pale, jaw set in the stubborn way of a man trained to keep moving when his mind begged him to stop. He was 38, built lean and hard from years of SEAL work, with a face carved by salt, sun, and sleeplessness. Sharp cheekbones, a small scar near his right brow, eyes the color of old steel that rarely softened. He spoke little, not because he lacked words, but because words had once failed him in rooms where grief sat heavier than gear. Since leaving the teams, he lived at the edge of the Oregon woods, taking odd jobs, keeping his world small enough to control. Nights were the worst. Some memories returned like tidewater, silent, inevitable, and cold, and he would lie awake listening for threats that weren't there. The only steady thing in his orbit was Gus. Gus, a German Shepherd just past 5, rode in the passenger seat like a co-pilot with a doctorate in intuition. He was large but athletic, sable coat slicked dark by humidity, ears like alert triangles, and amber-brown eyes that watched everything without panic. Gus didn't bark much. He communicated in posture, in a twitch of ear, in the way his chest rose when the air carried something wrong. He had been David's service dog once, trained for calm, distance, and loyalty, but time had turned him into something more personal, a bridge between David and the living world. When David's thoughts spiraled, Gus would press his muzzle into David's palm, as if anchoring him to the present. Tonight, Gus was unusually tense, nose working the air through a crack in the window, as if the storm carried a scent that didn't belong to weather. David preferred backroads because they were empty. Empty meant fewer surprises. That belief had kept him alive long enough to become a habit, and habits are harder to shed than uniforms. He was halfway through telling himself he'd be home soon, that he could microwave something and pretend it counted as dinner, when his headlights washed over movement ahead, pale shapes struggling against the wind on the shoulder. 4 figures, not a broken-down car, not a deer. People. The first was a woman, young but worn the way some people age in a single season. Her name, David would learn, was Emily Harper, late 20s, slender and underfed in a denim jacket that had no business fighting this kind of cold. Her hair, chestnut and soaked, clung to her cheeks. Her skin was light and blotched pink from the rain. Her eyes were wide with the focused fear of a mother rationing every breath. She held the hand of a boy, Noah, about 9, lanky and protective, shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself into a shield. Noah's face was freckled, lips cracked, and his gaze kept flicking toward the tree line as if he expected the forest to step out and accuse them. Beside them stumbled a small girl, Mia, maybe 5, a tiny bundle in a red knit hat that had slipped sideways over her brow. Mia's knees wobbled. Her mouth was slightly open. Each exhale looked like it cost her something. Behind them walked a man carrying a soaked duffel bag, broad-shouldered but tired in the bones. He was Jake Miller, early 30s, dark stubble, jawline angular, eyes wary in the way of someone who had learned that help often comes with hooks. His posture told a story. He kept his body between the road and the family like a human guardrail. David's first thought was automatic, drilled into him by hard lessons and the stories whispered at gas stations. Don't stop. Don't get boxed in. Don't invite trouble into your vehicle. He could almost hear an old instructor's voice, cold as a bolt. Kindness can get you killed if you treat it like a reflex. His foot hovered, uncertain, and his chest tightened with that familiar private shame, the one that always arrived when he chose safety over compassion. He told himself the county would send help. He told himself someone else would stop. He told himself, like a prayer he didn't believe, that he was not responsible for every broken thing on the road. Then Gus made a sound David hadn't heard in months, a low, vibrating growl that wasn't aggression, but alarm. Gus leaned forward, ears pinned, nose flaring, then turned and looked at David, eyes hard with insistence. He pawed the door once, sharp and deliberate, like a knock. In that gesture, David felt something shift. Gus wasn't asking for danger. He was asking for humanity. David caught Mia's face in the beam for half a second, pale, trembling, eyes glassy with exhaustion. The red hat, bright as a tiny distress flare, made her look less like a stranger and more like a child from any story where winter tries to win. David swore under his breath, not at them, but at himself, and slowed. He didn't pull up beside them at first. He rolled ahead, stopped where the shoulder widened, and waited, engine running. He cracked the window only a few inches, keeping the frame between his face and the storm, the way he'd been trained to create space. But when Jake approached, hands visible, shoulders raised in surrender, David heard the tremor in his voice and recognized it. That tremor wasn't a con. It was a man trying not to collapse. "My little girl's sick," Jake shouted over the rain. "She can't keep walking. Please, just a ride to town. We don't want money." David's instincts argued. His conscience answered. Gus pressed his nose to the gap in the window and whined once, soft and urgent. David exhaled, long and controlled, then reached over and unlocked the doors. "Get in," he said, voice rough but steady. "Fast." Emily climbed in first, hauling Mia close, her hands shaking as she buckled the child. Noah followed, trying to look brave and failing in a way only kids can, his eyes too old for his face. Jake slid into the back, duffel at his feet, wet clothes smelling of mud and road. David cranked the heat. Gus shifted immediately, careful and gentle, and nudged Mia's hand with his warm tongue like a living hot water bottle. Mia didn't smile, but her shoulders loosened a fraction, and in that tiny easing, David felt the weight inside his chest change shape. As the SUV pulled back onto the road, Emily spoke in broken fragments, voice thin with embarrassment. They'd been locked out that afternoon. New owner. No warning they could prove. No time to grab blankets. David listened without looking at her, eyes fixed on the slick ribbon of asphalt, because if he met her gaze, he might see the exact moment he'd almost driven past, and he wasn't ready to forgive himself. Gus suddenly lifted his head, ears snapping upright. His eyes went to the rearview mirror. David glanced up and saw it too. A pair of headlights, too close, moving with them through the storm, like a question that refused to be ignored. The rain thinned into needles, and the road's black ribbon began to shine with the sickly glow of distant neon. David didn't head for town the way a good citizen would. He followed instinct and old training, keeping speed steady, checking mirrors, counting exits, listening to the engine and to Gus. The headlights behind them still hovered too close, like a thought that wouldn't leave. David's pulse stayed low, controlled, the way it did when danger was possible but not confirmed. He hated that calm. It meant his body had chosen war settings again. A small flickering sign appeared ahead. Last chance fuel. Beside it, a squat building with a diner window glowing amber, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and forgiveness. David swung in without signaling, a subtle move meant to avoid telegraphing intention. Gravel popped under the tires. The pursuing headlights rolled past the entrance and kept going, as if they had only been curious, or as if they were patient. Inside the SUV, Emily's shoulders were still hunched, but the warmth had put a faint color back into her face. Up close, David could see she was the type of woman who tried to disappear so her children could take up space. Her fingers were raw around the nails, as if she'd been picking at skin to stay awake. She kept smoothing Mia's red knit hat, even though it was now drying by the vents, a nervous ritual, like polishing a talisman. Jake sat rigid, his broad frame folded too tightly into the back seat, eyes tracking every movement outside. He had that familiar edge, a man who'd lived long enough around the wrong people to distrust kindness. Noah watched David with guarded admiration, the way boys watch men they suspect might be heroes. Mia's breathing was shallow, her cheeks too hot. David parked under the brightest light. He didn't ask anyone if they wanted to come in. He gave orders, because orders were easier than negotiating fear. "Emily, you're with me. We'll get medicine, food. Jake, stay with the kids. Gus stays with them." Gus looked back at David as if he understood the assignment, then turned and settled beside Mia, his body a warm barricade between her and the night. The diner bell jingled when David pushed the door open. Heat rolled out like a blanket. The air tasted of frying oil and sugar. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 60s with a silver braid and a face that had seen 1,000 storms without getting impressed by any of them. Her name tag read Margie, and she wore that particular brand of small-town toughness, soft voice, sharp eyes, hands that moved with practiced certainty. She looked David up and down, noting the military stiffness in his spine and the rainwater darkening his jacket. "You look like you're carrying the weather," she said, not unkindly. "Just passing through," David replied. His voice always sounded like it had been sanded down. Margie slid 2 menus across the counter anyway. That's what everyone says before the night gets interesting. Emily hovered behind David, wringing her hands. Under the fluorescent light, she looked younger and somehow more exhausted. She whispered, "We don't have—" David cut her off gently but firmly. "I do." He didn't say money. He said "I," as if taking responsibility could be spoken into existence. He bought hot soup, bread, and 2 pastries dusted with sugar. He asked Margie where the pharmacy aisle was, and she pointed to a small shelf near the restroom. Basic painkillers, cough syrup, bandages, the little civilian arsenal against misery. David grabbed children's fever reducer, a thermometer, and a bottle of water. He didn't debate the dosage in his head. He read the label twice like it was a mission brief. Emily followed, eyes shiny with the kind of gratitude that feels like humiliation. Back at the car, Jake cracked the door before David reached it, still wary. David handed over the bag of food and the medicine. "She needs this. Small sips. Slow." Jake shook his head, pride flaring like a last match in the rain. "We can't take all that." David's stare held, calm but unmovable. "Kids don't pay for adult pride," he said. It wasn't anger. It was doctrine. Jake's jaw worked as if he wanted to argue, but the fight drained out of him when Mia coughed, a small, broken sound. He took the medicine with hands that trembled for reasons that weren't just cold. Inside, Gus did something so gentle it hurt to watch. He lowered his head to Mia's lap and let her small fingers bury into the fur at his neck. Then, as if on cue, he made a ridiculous sneeze snort, the kind dogs do when they're trying to be funny and don't care how undignified it looks. Mia let out a tiny laugh, surprised by her own voice, and Emily covered her mouth like laughter was something holy she didn't deserve anymore. Gus, pleased, thumped his tail once against the seat. David stood there in the rain for a second longer than necessary, watching them. A memory rose uninvited, not of combat, but of silence. The silence in his cabin at home. The silence after phone calls he never returned. The silence he had mistaken for peace. Seeing Mia laugh, hearing it, he realized what he'd been hoarding wasn't safety. It was emptiness. Gus abruptly lifted his head. The mood shifted. He hopped down from the seat and moved toward the diner's back wall, nose working hard. David followed him inside without thinking, boots leaving wet prints like punctuation marks. Gus prowled along the edge of the room, then froze near a chair where a men's jacket hung, damp and carelessly draped as if someone had stood up in a hurry. Gus sniffed, once, twice, then gave a low growl that made the hair on David's arms rise. It wasn't the growl of a dog guarding food. It was the growl of recognition. David's eyes swept the diner. Most of the booths were empty. A trucker in a cap chewed slowly, staring at his plate. A young couple scrolled their phones, oblivious. Near the window stood a man in his 30s, lean, with a sharp nose and restless shoulders, pretending to smoke while barely inhaling. He wore a dark hoodie pulled up, rain beating on the fabric, and his gaze kept sliding toward David's SUV with an interest that didn't match casual boredom. There was nothing dramatic about him, which made him worse. Predators rarely look like monsters. They look like somebody's cousin waiting for a ride. David didn't confront him. Confrontation was a spark. He needed darkness. He paid quickly, added a tip that made Margie's eyebrows lift, and asked in a low voice, "You see that guy by the window often?" Margie glanced once, subtle as a card dealer. "Not often enough for my liking," she murmured. "Want me to call someone?" "Not yet." David's eyes stayed level. "Just keep the door buzzer loud." Outside, Jake sensed the change the way men who've lived with fear can smell it. "What is it?" he asked as David approached. David leaned in, voice low so the rain could swallow it. "Tell me the truth, Jake. All of it. Why are you on foot in a storm?" Jake stared at the dashboard, at the fogged glass, at the steam of their breath. His face tightened, and the story seemed to bruise him from the inside out. "We're not just broke," he admitted. I worked for someone. A lender, not a bank." His fingers clenched. "He used me for dirty errands, threats, collections. I quit. I ran. I thought if I kept moving, he'd get bored." He swallowed hard. "People like that don't get bored. They get even." Emily's eyes flashed with fierce shame. "He did it so we could eat," she whispered. "And he stopped so our kids could sleep." David looked at the road beyond the lights. His brain began assembling a new route with the cold efficiency of a man who had planned evacuations under worse conditions. If that man outside was a spotter, town was a trap. Police stations were obvious. Shelters were predictable. Predictable got people found. David opened the driver's door and spoke like he was cutting a knot. "We're not going into town." Jake's head jerked up. "What? But—" "I've got a place," David continued. "A cabin on a hill, garage on the property." The words tasted strange, like inviting strangers into a wound. 1 week. Trial. I need someone who can fix machines. You work, you earn. Roof, heat, food, no charity. He paused, then added the truest part, softer. "My dog says you're not lying." Emily looked at Gus, as if asking the universe for a signature. Gus stepped forward and pressed his heavy head into her palm, steady and warm, the simplest kind of oath. They pulled out. David kept the SUV's lights low, speed steady. In the mirror, the man by the diner didn't move. And then, a mile down the road, the familiar headlights appeared again behind them, following, until they suddenly clicked off, swallowed by rain and darkness. Gus's growl returned, quiet and continuous, like a warning bell that refused to stop ringing. Dawn arrived thin and colorless, washing the hill in mist and making the trees below look like drowned ghosts lifting their hands from the valley. David's cabin sat above it all, a sturdy structure of weathered cedar and stone, clean in the way a museum is clean, nothing out of place, nothing alive. He kept it that way on purpose. Order was his religion now. Chaos was what happened when you cared. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine cleaner and cold iron. There was a row of framed photographs on a shelf in the living room, all men in uniforms, all smiles caught mid-laugh like stolen sunlight. David never looked at those photos for long. The longer he stared, the more he could hear the missing voices. A faded navy jacket hung on a hook by the door, shoulders wide, sleeves empty, like it was still waiting for its owner to return from somewhere he would never name. In the corner, beside the fireplace, sat Gus's steel food bowl, scuffed from years of loyalty, and next to it, a neatly folded dog blanket. Emily noticed these things the way mothers notice drafts and bruises, quickly, quietly, and with an instinctive ache. She didn't say anything, but her eyes softened with a kind of understanding that made David feel exposed. Emily moved through the cabin like someone afraid to break a spell. In the daylight, her features were clearer, fine-boned, with a sharp chin and tired eyes the shade of hazel tea. Her hands were small but capable, knuckles reddened from cold and hard work. She was the kind of woman who apologized with her posture, shoulders rounded as if she took up too much space simply by existing. But when Mia coughed in her sleep, Emily's spine straightened and her face tightened into steel. She had learned to be gentle and relentless at the same time. Noah, all elbows and cautious bravery, took off his wet shoes at the door without being told. He scanned the room, counting exits the way frightened kids do, then hovered near his sister as if he could guard her with willpower alone. Jake stayed near the window, gaze tracking the tree line, the road, the angle of the driveway. Even in warmth, his body didn't fully unclench. David set up the spare room for the kids without ceremony. Clean sheets, a space heater, a glass of water, the thermometer. He checked Mia's temperature again, jaw tightening at the number, then timed the next dose on his phone like it was a scheduled extraction. Gus lay at the foot of Mia's bed, head on paws, eyes half-lidded but alert, a quiet sentinel with fur instead of armor. When Mia stirred, Gus nudged her gently with his nose, and she smiled without opening her eyes, as if the dog's presence was a lullaby her body understood. After the family settled, David led Jake out back to the garage. It stood a few yards from the cabin, a big, old structure with a sagging roofline and double doors that looked like they'd been holding their breath for a decade. The place had once belonged to David's father, a man who fixed engines and mended broken tools for the mountain folks, charging less than he should have because he couldn't stand to see anyone stranded. That generosity had shaped David in ways he didn't like admitting. When David's father died, the garage died too, sealed like a tomb. David wrestled with the latch. The metal groaned, reluctant to wake. Dust swirled when the doors finally opened, catching sunlight in slow, drifting specks like tiny ghosts doing a lazy waltz. The smell inside was oil gone stale, wood damp with time, and rust blooming on steel. Tools hung on pegboards like relics, wrenches, sockets, a vise, a battered drill press, all silent and waiting. A workbench ran along the wall, thick hardwood scarred with old labor. A calendar from years ago still clung to a nail, its last month forever unfinished. Jake stepped in and stopped like a man walking into a church he'd forgotten he believed in. In the clearer light, his face looked more angular, cheekbones pronounced from stress, eyes a deep brown with a permanent edge of caution. His hands were his tell, strong, nicked, the nails stained with the honest grime of real work. When he moved, it was efficient, practiced, the kind of movement that comes from years of fixing things because nobody else will. He didn't gush, didn't flatter, didn't ask permission. He simply reached for a can of penetrating oil on a shelf as if it had always been his. "Mind if I—" he started, voice rough. David surprised himself. "Go ahead." Jake got to work. He loosened the stiff door hinge with oil and patient pressure, not brute force. He wiped down a section of the bench with an old rag, revealing the warm grain beneath the gray film. He tapped a wrench lightly against his palm, listening to its ring, testing balance like a musician checking an instrument. David stood in the doorway watching, chest tight, because the scene was familiar in a way he couldn't place at first. Then it hit him. This was what it felt like to have a teammate again. Not a soldier, not a shadow. A person beside him who was building instead of surviving. The peace didn't last. It never did. A sharp crunch of tires on gravel cut through the morning. Gus's head snapped up, ears forward. David turned as a black pickup truck climbed the driveway like it owned the hill. It was too clean for this road, paint glossy, windows tinted. The engine purred with the confidence of money. The driver stepped out and shut the door with unnecessary force, like punctuation. Mark Donovan, David's cousin, was 39 and looked like a man who'd spent more time in boardrooms than in storms. He wore an expensive coat that didn't fit the setting and a watch that flashed like a threat. His hair was dark, perfectly styled, and his smile was the kind you see on contracts, polite, practiced, and designed to win without bleeding. Under that smile lived something sharper. Mark had grown up with David, but where David learned discipline, Mark learned leverage. A bad business deal in his 20s had changed him, they said, turned him into a man who hated being powerless more than he hated being cruel. Mark's eyes flicked over the garage, the dust, the tools, and he dismissed it all in half a second. Then his gaze landed on Jake, taking in the soaked boots and worn jacket like he was checking for stains. "David," Mark called, voice loud and friendly in the way predators pretend. "We need to talk." David stepped forward, shoulders squared. "Not a good time." Mark's smile widened. "It's always a good time when property values are rising." He walked closer, hands in pockets, as if he belonged in the doorway of David's life. "Listen, cousin, I've been handling things while you've been adjusting." His eyes dropped to David's jacket, lingering on the military stiffness, the old scars. "The land is too valuable to rot up here. A developer wants it. Resort cabins, trails, the whole dream. They've already drafted paperwork. I've got contacts. I've got a plan." David's voice stayed even, dangerous in its calm. "My house isn't for sale." Mark shrugged as if David were being sentimental about a couch. "You're not exactly stable, David. People talk. PTSD, isolation. You disappear for days. That's not me judging. That's reality." He turned his head slightly, enough to glance toward the cabin where Emily and the kids were. "And now you've got strangers, children. You know what that looks like, right? One call and you've got trouble on your doorstep." Emily appeared in the cabin doorway then, pale but upright, holding Noah's hand. She looked like she hadn't slept, yet there was a fierce steadiness in her face. "We're not trouble," she said, voice trembling only at the edges. "We're people." Mark's eyes skimmed her like she was an inconvenience. "Ma'am, I'm sure you are, but this isn't a shelter." Gus moved, silent as a shadow, stepping between Mia's small figure and Mark's line of sight. His growl was low, controlled, a warning that came from certainty, not fear. David didn't hit Mark. The old David, the one Mark expected, might have. Instead, David did something colder. He looked Mark in the eye and let the silence stretch until Mark's smile started to crack. "Don't threaten my guests," David said, "and don't threaten my home." Mark let out a small laugh, the kind that tries to pretend it's amused when it's actually angry. "Fine," he said, backing up a step. "Keep playing house. But you should know this. Next week, social services and a deputy will come by. Someone's filed a concern about your mental health and the living situation here. That's what happens when you make reckless choices, cousin." He tipped his head, smile returning, like a mask snapping back into place. "Try to stay calm. Wouldn't want them to think I'm right." Then he got into his truck and drove away, leaving the driveway scraped with fresh tire tracks and the air tasting like metal. The rest of the day moved in careful silence. Jake didn't touch the tools much after that, but he didn't ask to leave either. Emily made soup from what they had, hands steady, eyes distant. Noah stayed close to Mia, watching David as if measuring him. David felt the old heaviness return, not from fear of the law, but from the possibility that he had just dragged innocent people into a war that was already waiting on his porch. Night fell early under swollen clouds. David checked locks twice. He set the porch light to stay on. He told himself he was being responsible. He told himself, again, that he was in control. Then Gus started barking at the garage. Not frantic barking, but sharp, focused, like an alarm. He ran to the back door, scratched at the floorboards, and looked up at David with urgent eyes. David grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, rain misting his face. At the garage's rear entrance, where the mud was thick and the grass flattened, the beam of light found it. A fresh boot print, deep and clean-edged, pressed into the wet earth. Too fresh to belong to any of them. David crouched, fingers hovering above the print without touching it, mind racing through angles and timing. Someone had been here. Someone had tested the back door. Maybe last night, maybe minutes ago. The hill suddenly felt less like refuge and more like a target. Gus's growl returned, steady as a drumbeat. Morning after morning, the hill woke to the sound of work instead of worry. The week moved like a quiet operation. No glory, no speeches, just tasks completed with stubborn care. David didn't call it healing, because that word felt too soft for what his body was learning. He called it a routine. Routines were safe, yet something had changed in the air. The cabin no longer smelled only of cleaner and solitude. It began to smell like toast, soap, and warm fabric drying near a vent, small civilian scents that somehow felt braver than gunfire. Jake worked the garage the way a man works his way out of shame, methodically, without asking for applause. He repaired the generator first, hands steady, eyes narrowed as he listened to the engine's complaint like it was speaking a language he respected. He patched a leak in the roof with tar and scrap metal, then built new shelving from old planks, sanding them until the wood looked alive again. He didn't talk much, but the few times he did, his words came out blunt and sincere. "I won't waste what you're giving us," he told David one night, voice low, as if promising was a sacred act. Emily transformed the cabin with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to build comfort out of almost nothing. She washed curtains David hadn't realized he owned, hung them so the windows looked less like watchtowers, and placed a small jar of wildflowers on the table like a peace offering to the room itself. Her cooking was simple, but it carried a warmth that made David's chest ache in an unfamiliar way. She also ran the household with a careful dignity, never acting like a guest begging for mercy, never acting like a queen. Just a mother rebuilding a nest. She made Noah and Mia fold blankets, wash dishes, and say thank you, not because she was strict, but because she wanted them to remember they were still a family with standards, not refugees waiting for the world to decide their worth. Mia's fever broke midweek. The moment she stopped shivering, Gus seemed to exhale too. He became her shadow in sunlight, trotting alongside her as she ran circles on the damp grass, the red knit hat now dry and perched properly, like it had forgiven the storm. Mia started laughing more, a small sound at first, then louder, especially when Gus performed his favorite trick, picking up a stick that was clearly too big for him and prancing like he'd won a trophy. Noah, who had been guarded and watchful, began to loosen. He started a garden patch near the porch, digging with a borrowed trowel and the seriousness of an old farmer. "If we're here," he told David, dirt on his nose, "we should make it better." David didn't know what to say to that, so he nodded like it was an order he could follow. David did his own work too, the work nobody saw. He drove into town twice, dressed plainly, cap low, moving with the alert calm of someone who had learned to scan rooms before sitting down. At the clinic, he met with a psychiatrist, Dr. Hannah Reed, a woman in her early 40s with short dark hair and a steady gaze that never flinched when David's silence stretched. She had a simple presence, not warm like a hug, but stable like a handrail. Her questions were direct. Her voice was calm. She didn't treat him like a hero or a hazard. She treated him like a man with history who still deserved a future. When she signed his evaluation stating he was competent and stable, David felt something loosen in his throat, almost like grief trying to turn into relief. He also visited a notary public, Dale Simmons, a narrow-faced man with wire-frame glasses and ink-stained fingers, the sort of small-town professional who loved rules because rules made the world predictable. David brought paperwork, a temporary employment agreement for Jake as a live-in mechanic and caretaker, a simple plan outlining repairs and responsibilities, and a document stating Emily and the children were guests, not squatters. Dale stamped and signed without drama, but his eyes narrowed when David mentioned a relative threatening legal action. "People get strange when land gets expensive," Dale muttered, as if that sentence belonged in a history book. The inspection arrived on a bright, cold morning, the kind that makes everything look innocent. A county SUV climbed the driveway, followed by a patrol car, and behind them, Mark's glossy pickup. Mark stepped out smiling like a man walking toward a prize. He wore a scarf that looked too clean for this air and carried himself with the practiced confidence of someone who believes the world bends for him. From the county SUV emerged a social worker, Ms. Laura Perez, mid-30s, tall and composed, with olive-toned skin and hair pulled into a neat bun. Her eyes were sharp but not cruel, the eyes of someone who has seen genuine suffering and learned to separate it from performance. She held a folder tight against her coat, posture professional, face unreadable. The deputy, Officer Tom Briggs, was a broad man in his 40s with a square jaw and kind, tired eyes, the kind of lawman who had broken up enough fights to hate ego but still believe in decency. Mark started talking before anyone could breathe. "Thank God you're here," he said, voice loud enough to make it sound like a public service announcement. "My cousin is not well. PTSD, isolation, strangers living here, children at risk. I'm afraid he's being manipulated." David stepped onto the porch slowly, Gus at his side, not barking, just present. Emily stood behind David with Noah and Mia, all three clean, bundled, and calm. Jake came from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, face steady, shoulders squared. No one looked like prey. Ms. Perez's eyes swept the scene. She didn't rush to judgment. "Mr. Brown," she said, "we received a report. We need to ensure the children are safe and that your living situation is stable." David nodded once. "Of course." He opened the door wider. "Please come in." He didn't sound defensive. He sounded prepared. The cabin, once a sterile cave, now looked like a home. A pot of soup cooled on the stove. The first aid shelf was stocked. Mia's medicine sat labeled and in reach. Fresh blankets were folded neatly. Noah's school workbook lay on the table with a sharpened pencil beside it. Ms. Perez checked the children's room, noted the heater, the clean sheets, the water glass, the thermometer. She asked Noah gentle questions. Noah answered clearly. She looked at Emily's hands, then at the children's faces, and something in her expression softened by a fraction. Mark's smile began to twitch. He pointed at Jake. "That man is dangerous. He's involved with criminals. My cousin doesn't know who he let into his house." Jake's face tightened, shame flashing, but he didn't retreat. Gus stepped forward and sat down between Mia and Mark, back straight, eyes locked on Mark with a quiet intensity that felt like judgment. He didn't snarl. He didn't lunge. He simply placed himself there, a living line no one could cross without being noticed. Ms. Perez tilted her head. "Is your dog trained?" David's voice came steady. "He's my service dog. He's also my friend. He knows who's safe." Officer Briggs studied Gus, then Mark, then the family. "Service dogs don't usually sit like that unless they're reading something," he muttered, half to himself. Mark scoffed. "This is all a show." David didn't argue. He handed Ms. Perez a folder. Inside was Dr. Reed's signed evaluation, Dale's notarized documents, Jake's employment agreement, and a written repair plan for the garage. Ms. Perez read carefully, lips pressing together as she processed the thoroughness. "This is organized," she said, not quite hiding her surprise. Mark's frustration snapped. "He's being fooled. You're all being fooled." Officer Briggs glanced at Mark's truck, then at his name as it appeared on the report. His brow furrowed. "Donovan," he said slowly, as if tasting the name. "You related to the Donovan being looked at for facilitating collections down in Maple Glen?" Mark's face drained of color so fast it looked like the morning had stolen it. "What?" he barked, too sharp. Briggs's eyes narrowed. "We've got an open investigation, a crew running intimidation loans. A couple names keep popping up as introducers." He looked at Mark again, not accusing, but attentive in the way cops get when a puzzle piece clicks. Jake swallowed, then pulled something from his pocket, hands trembling but determined. It was a crumpled photocopy and a small stack of messages printed from an old phone, the kind of evidence people keep when they're afraid no one will believe them. "I didn't want to bring this here," Jake said, voice thick. "But he's lying." He pointed at Mark. "He's the one who introduced me. He told me who to work for. He said it was just debt collection." Mark's mouth opened, then shut. His smile was gone now, replaced by a panic he couldn't bargain away. "This is fabricated," he spat, but it sounded thin, like a man shouting at a tide. Ms. Perez looked from the papers to Jake's face, then to Emily's. She didn't see parasites. She saw exhausted people trying to stand upright. "Mr. Donovan," she said, voice now colder, "filing a false report is serious." Officer Briggs nodded. "And if you're interfering with an investigation, it gets worse." Mark took a step back, eyes flicking to Gus, to David, to the deputy. Gus didn't move. He simply watched, as if memorizing Mark for the future. Mark's pride tried one last time to stand. "You'll regret this," he hissed at David. David's expression didn't change. "I already regret a lot," he said quietly, "but not this." Mark left in a fury of gravel and exhaust. Halfway down the driveway, he stopped, leaned out his window, and threw his parting gift like a curse. "You think this is over? That crew doesn't let people walk away." The hill fell silent again after the vehicles departed, but it was a different silence now. not the suffocating kind David used to live inside. Emily's knees buckled a little with delayed fear. Noah hugged Mia close. Jake stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone who had just survived judgment. David looked down at Gus, who finally relaxed, tail swishing once, and David realized the dog had done more than guard a child. Gus had guarded the truth. That night, as darkness thickened over the valley, a low engine sound drifted from far below the hill, lingering, idling, as if something waited in the shadows at the edge of the road. Gus's ears pricked. His growl began, quiet and unwavering. Night settled over the hill like a held breath. The trees below swayed in slow, dark agreement, and the valley lights looked far away, as if the world had politely stepped back to see what David would do next. He stood at the living room window with Gus at his heel, listening to the low engine idling somewhere down the dirt road. It wasn't close enough to be a knock, but it was near enough to be a message. In another life, David might have answered that message with force. That was what people expected from a Navy SEAL, as if the title came with a permanent license to become violence. But David had learned the hard lesson most stories skip. Winning a moment is easy. Winning a life is harder. He turned away from the window and looked at the family he'd pulled into his orbit. Emily sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. In the light, she looked almost translucent with worry, but her eyes stayed fixed and clear, like she'd already decided she would not fall apart where her children could see. Jake paced once, then stopped, jaw clenched, guilt rising in him like smoke. Noah had dragged a blanket to the hallway and positioned himself near Mia's door as if he were the smallest soldier on duty. Mia slept with Gus's old blanket tucked around her, the red knit hat folded neatly on the nightstand like a lucky charm set aside for mourning. David lowered his voice and made his plan simple, because simple plans are the ones frightened people can hold. Nobody goes outside, he said. Nobody opens the door for anyone. He didn't speak like a commander. He spoke like a man asking for trust he had once thought he didn't deserve. He called the sheriff's non-emergency line, not dramatic, not theatrical. He described the idling vehicle at the foot of the hill, the recent intimidation report, and the concern for a family with children. The dispatcher who answered sounded young, brisk, and slightly tired, the kind of voice that had learned to keep calm for strangers. Her name was Kendra, and she spoke in clipped sentences that weren't cold, just efficient. "Units can do extra passes," she said. "Keep your lights on. Don't engage." David did what she said. He switched on every exterior light, flooding the yard with white clarity. He set up 2 cameras he'd used for property monitoring, small weatherproof boxes with wide-angle lenses, and positioned them to cover the driveway and the garage doors. He didn't announce it like a victory. He did it like changing a bandage. Gus moved with him, silent and purposeful. David placed him on the porch behind the glass storm door, where the dog could see and smell without being exposed. Gus wasn't a weapon. He didn't posture or bark to prove anything. He sat there like a living alarm system with a heart. When danger whispered, Gus's ears sharpened. When safety returned, his body loosened. He was, as David thought bitterly and fondly at once, a wind chime made of instinct. He didn't create storms. He simply sang when they arrived. The idling engine down the hill finally grew louder. Headlights crawled up the road, not rushing, as if the driver wanted to be seen. The vehicle emerged from the tree line, a dark sedan with tinted windows, paint dull like it had lived on backroads too long. It rolled to a stop at the edge of David's property. Another set of lights appeared behind it, then another, forming a small, patient line. David's pulse stayed low. He didn't step outside. He didn't grab a weapon. He stood behind the window where the cameras could see him too, because visibility mattered. The men got out slowly, 3 of them. Their silhouettes were ordinary: hoodies, jeans, hands in pockets. Ordinary men were always the most terrifying, because ordinary was how cruelty disguised itself in daylight. One man, taller than the others, had a narrow face and a shaved head that gleamed under the yard light. Even at a distance, his posture radiated entitlement, like he believed the world owed him compliance. He looked toward the cabin and smiled, a small curve that was less friendly than it was hungry. Jake saw them through the window and flinched as if he'd been struck. "That's him," he whispered. "The lender." His voice cracked on the word, because lender was too polite for what the man actually was. Emily rose from the table and placed a hand on Jake's arm, not to comfort him, but to steady him. "We're not running again," she murmured. It wasn't bravado. It was exhaustion turning into resolve. Outside, the tall man lifted his chin and called out. His voice carried up the hill, smooth as oil. "Jake, we know you're here. You can make this easy." He laughed, and the laugh sounded like a door locking. "Come talk like a man." Gus's chest rumbled. Not frantic, not wild, just a warning note that filled the porch. David placed a hand on Gus's neck, feeling the dog's muscles tense beneath the fur. "Easy," David whispered, more to himself than to Gus. Then, down the driveway, a new set of headlights crested the rise. A patrol car, slow and deliberate, spotlight sweeping across the road. Behind it, another cruiser appeared, and then a sheriff's SUV. The sudden presence of official light changed the whole geometry of the night. The men at the edge of the property paused. The tall man's smile twitched, recalculated. He hadn't come for a scene with witnesses. He'd come for fear. Officer Briggs stepped out of the first cruiser, shoulders squared against the cold. He looked even broader under his jacket, face set in that weary patience of a man who'd seen too many bullies try to pretend they were businessmen. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply walked forward, flashlight beam steady, and spoke in a tone that made it clear this hill was no longer private prey. "Evening, gentlemen. Property lines back there. You need something. You can file it the legal way." The tall man smirked. "We're just talking." Briggs's gaze didn't blink. "You can talk from the public road, and you can leave now." Another deputy stood beside him, hand resting near a radio, posture calm but ready. Cameras watched. Lights blazed. The family watched from inside, held together by the thin thread of hope and the warm weight of Gus's presence. The men backed away, irritation in their movements like static. The tall man called out one last time, voice softening into a promise. "This isn't done." Briggs pointed his flashlight down the road. "It is tonight." The cars turned around and rolled away, tires crunching gravel like reluctant surrender. The hill exhaled. Gus's growl faded into silence, tail thumping once, as if marking the end of a chapter. In the aftermath, Emily's hands began to shake, delayed tremors from fear she'd refused to show earlier. David poured her a glass of water. His own hands were steady, but his chest felt bruised, as if he'd been fighting a battle without swinging a fist. Jake stared at the window long after the headlights disappeared. "I brought this to you," he said hoarsely, shame turning his voice into gravel. "I'm sorry." David shook his head once. "You didn't bring it," he replied. "It was already out there. All you did was give me a reason to face it." The words surprised him with their truth. Weeks passed, then months. The garage became a living thing again. Locals began driving up the hill for repairs, drawn by word of mouth and the honest fairness of Jake's work. He didn't just fix machines. He explained them, taught owners how to listen for trouble before it became disaster, the way he had once listened to danger in the dark. Emily set up a small kitchen corner near the garage entrance, selling coffee and pastries on weekends, her hands now busy with dough instead of worry. The first time she hung a small chalkboard sign that read, "Warm coffee today," David felt something inside him loosen, because it was proof that the house could welcome strangers without being conquered by them. Noah's garden expanded into neat rows. Mia grew stronger and bolder, racing Gus across the yard until the dog pretended to lose so she could win, because even shepherds understand the importance of letting children feel powerful. Gus became the unofficial mayor of the hill, greeting customers with calm dignity, leaning into old men's hands, sitting quietly beside anxious visitors the way he used to sit beside David. People would arrive with engines that rattled and leave with softer faces, as if the hill repaired more than metal. And David, who had once measured safety by silence, began to measure it by laughter. He started sleeping through the night. Not every night, but more nights than not. The memories still existed, but they stopped dragging him by the throat. Sometimes he'd wake and hear the house breathing, Emily washing a mug, Jake humming while tightening a bolt, Noah reading out loud, Mia giggling as Gus sneezed dramatically at her toy. Those sounds didn't threaten him. They anchored him. One evening, after a steady rain had washed the dust from the driveway, David sat on the porch steps with Gus's head resting on his knee. The valley lights blinked below like distant stars. David scratched behind Gus's ears and felt the dog's contentment vibrate through his palm. He thought about the night he almost kept driving, about how close he'd come to choosing emptiness again. He realized the miracle wasn't only that he'd saved a family. The deeper miracle was that the family and the dog had pulled him back into his own life. The hill was no longer silent. Sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives with headlights in a storm and a decision made in the quiet space between fear and faith. David thought he was saving a family that night, but God was also rescuing him, stitching a lonely heart back into the world with thread as simple as warmth, honesty, and a dog's loyal eyes. If you're watching this and you feel tired, unseen, or one step away from giving up, remember, the Lord often hides His answers inside ordinary moments, a door you choose to open, a hand you choose to offer, a pause you choose to make instead of speeding past. Tomorrow, look for someone you can help in a small, practical way. A kind word, a ride, a meal, a call you've been avoiding, forgiveness you've been delaying. Those are the daily miracles that change lives, including your own. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope, and drop a comment with the word faith and the city or state you're watching from so we can pray for one another. Please like this video and subscribe for more stories that strengthen the soul. May God bless you, protect your home, guide your steps, and send you the right people at the right time. In Jesus' name, amen.